The fourth type of joint is the synovial joint, also known as a diarthrosis or diarthrodial joint. Dia means separate or apart, and arthro again is joint and osis condition, so the condition of having a separate or apart joint. In these joints, the two bones are separated by a space that's called the joint cavity. The figure on the right here shows a general synovial joint. Synovial joints are the most familiar type of joint and the most freely movable. They're the most structurally complex type of joint and most likely to develop painful dysfunctions. These are the joints that are most important for physical and occupational therapists, athletic coaches, nurses, and fitness trainers. Their mobility makes them very important to the quality of life. We'll begin by looking at their general anatomy. First of all, at the end of each bone, there is an articular cartilage. We can see the articular cartilage here and over here on the corresponding surface. It's usually about 2 or 3 millimeters thick. This articular cartilage is surrounded by an articular cavity or joint cavity. You can see this cavity space in here. It separates the articular surfaces and is filled with a slippery lubricant called synovial fluid. It's rich in albumin and hyaluronic acid. Hyaluronic acid is a very slippery substance. This gives it a viscous and slippery texture. It's very similar in nature to raw egg whites. And it also allows nourishment of the articular cartilage and removal of waste, as the blood supply does not enter the joint capsule itself, but it can drop off its nutrients and remove wastes from the synovial fluid. This synovial fluid makes the movement of synovial joints almost friction-free. Let's look closely at the joint capsule. It's connective tissue that surrounds the joint and helps retain the fluid in the joint. There are two parts of it. There's an outer or fibrous capsule that you see here. And then it's lined by an inner synovial membrane, which is composed mainly of fibroblast-like cells that secrete the synovial fluid. It also contains macrophages that remove debris from the joint. Through using our joints in practices like yoga, where we increase the range of motion, we can actually stimulate this inner cellular membrane to secrete more synovial fluid and stimulate the macrophages to remove more debris from the joint. This is why it's so important to keep the joints with a solid working range of motion. It's almost like you take a dish towel and you squeeze it and compress the joint capsule as you release it out. As you squeeze it, you're bringing out old fluid, squishing it back into the blood supply. And as you release it, it sucks in fresh, new, nutrient-rich fluid. In a few of the synovial joints, we'll see that the fibrocartilage grows inward from the joint capsule and forms a pad between the articulating bones. In the temporomandibular joint and the distal radio-ulnar joints, the sternoclavicular and acromioclavicular joints, we'll see an articular disc. This is a pad that crosses the entire joint between the articulating ends of the bones within the joint capsule. In the knee, we see a meniscus. A meniscus is different because it doesn't cross the joint entirely. We have one growing in from the left side and one growing in from the right side, but they don't connect in the middle. These cartilages act to absorb shock and pressure. They also help guide the bones across each other and improve the fit between the bones. In addition, they stabilize the joints and reduce the chance of dislocation. Some other accessory structures that are associated with synovial joints are tendons, ligaments, and bursa. Tendons are strips or sheets of tough collagenous tissue that attach muscle to bone. They're often the most important structure in stabilizing a joint. We'll spend more time looking at them as we examine muscles in future chapters. Ligaments are made of very similar tissue to tendons. However, they attach one bone to the other. So tendons, muscle to bone, ligaments are bone to bone. Bursa are fibrous sacs that are filled with synovial fluid. They're located between adjacent muscles, or where tendons pass over a bone, or between a bone and skin. They act to cushion muscles and help tendons slide more easily over joints. And often they can actually be involved in modifying the direction of pull that a tendon has on a joint in order to make that joint more efficient. You can see here in the hand several different bursa, and they allow tendons to slide across each other and pass over the bones with much less friction. Some of these bursa can be modified to form tendon sheaths. These are elongated cylindrical bursa that are wrapped around a tendon. You can see the radial bursa here as a tendon sheath. So as we were just exploring articular cartilage and synovial fluid, let's look at some of the benefits of exercise. In addition to compression of the joint and increasing mobility of the joint, stimulating the cells to release more synovial fluid, we find that exercise acts to warm the synovial fluid, which makes it less viscous, much more thin, and it's more easily absorbed by the articular cartilage. This is why it's so important to have a warm-up period on our way into vigorous exercise. It helps protect the cartilage from undue wear and tear. As the synovial fluid becomes less viscous, it allows the cartilage to swell, and thus it provides much more effective cushioning against compression. The repetitive compression that we see during weight-bearing exercise is very important to the health of cartilage. Cartilage is non-vascular. During exercise, as we compress it, the fluid gets squeezed out of the cartilage, and that releases metabolic waste. When the compression is removed, the cartilage rebounds, and as it does, it absorbs synovial fluid like a sponge, and it takes in oxygen and nutrients, and the oxygen and nutrients fuel the chondrocytes, allowing them to essentially live a better life. Without exercise, we see that cartilage deteriorates much more rapidly from inadequate nutrition and waste removal. So weight-bearing exercise also builds bone mass and strengthens the muscles, which helps stabilize the joints. Thus, we have less risk of joint injury and dislocations. However, excessive stress on the joints hastens the progression of osteoarthritis. It damages the articular cartilage. So things like yoga and swimming are really good to put in the mix, rather than just pounding the pavement with consistent running or jumping. So here we'll take a little venture into some physics. Joints act as levers that can enhance and speed the power of limb movements. A lever is any elongated, rigid object that rotates around a fixed point called a fulcrum. So if you were to pry a rock out of the earth with a pry bar, you're using a lever system. In this situation, we see that rotation occurs when the effort applied overcomes the resistance or the load at some other point. You can see here in this seesaw example, if we had a particular resistance or load on one end of the plank, and then we sat on the other end of the plank, if we were heavy enough, we would overcome the resistance of the load on the other end, and it would rise, and our end that we sat on would go down. It does this around a fulcrum. The resistance arm is the arm that has the load on it, and the effort arm is the arm that we are applying some effort to. They're described relative to the fulcrum, and it depends on where the resistance is. The advantage that's conferred by a lever can be either of two kinds. One, we can exert more force against the resisting object than the force applied to the lever. And second, we move the resisting object further and faster than the effort arm is moved. In the first example, if we're using a crowbar to move a heavy object, we're able to exert a greater force against the object by using this lever in order to move it. In the second example, we're moving the object further and faster. For example, by using oars to row a boat. They rotate around a fulcrum, and thus we're able to propel the boat more quickly. One single lever cannot offer both advantages, because as one increases, the other decreases. This is what we term mechanical advantage. Mechanical advantage is the ratio of the output force to its input force. And it's calculated as the length of the effort arm divided by the length of the resistance arm. So if the mechanical advantage is greater than 1, the lever is producing more force, but less speed and distance than the force that's exerted on it. And if it's less than 1, the lever is producing more speed and distance, but less force than the input. So here, when we look at the elbow joint, you can see the fulcrum. The effort arm is very short, from the fulcrum to the biceps muscle. The biceps is pulling on the radius. That's where the effort is applied. The resistance or the load is up here in the hand. Here the resistance arm is very long. So we take the effort arm divided by the resistance arm, and we end up with a low mechanical advantage. We have low power, but high speed. In this other example, where we look at the jaw, we have a fulcrum here at the temporomandibular joint. The digastric muscle here provides the effort for opening the jaw, along with some other muscles. So the effort arm is relatively long. Tension in the temporalis muscle here provides the resistance against that. Thus, the resistance arm is much shorter. In this case, we'll see that the effort arm divided by the resistance arm gives us a number greater than 1. Thus, we see high mechanical advantage, which means we get high power but much lower speed. So there are 3 different classes of levers. The first class lever has a fulcrum in the middle between the effort and resistance. It's the seesaw example. We have resistance, fulcrum, effort. The atlanto-occipital joint is a great example of that. The joint lies between the muscles on the back of the neck and the weight of the face. So we have the resistance, which is the weight of the face, and the muscles on the back of the neck that hold the head back. Now, when you lose control of the muscle tone in the muscles in the back of the neck, you might nod off in class, your head jolts forward, and that can be quite embarrassing. You don't have to deal with that in this class. You can just pause the recording and come back later. A second class lever is where we see the resistance being between the fulcrum and the effort. This is like a wheelbarrow. We lift up on the handles and we're moving a resistance that is between the effort and the fulcrum. When we think about the temporalis muscle, we're looking at opening of the jaw. We see that the temporalis muscle is applying a resistance to keep the jaw closed, and the effort is by the digastric muscle on the chin. The fulcrum is outside of both of those. It may be hard to parallel to the wheelbarrow because it's sort of upside down. but the same mechanics apply. In a third-class lever, the effort is between the resistance and the fulcrum. An example of this is when we paddle a canoe. The fulcrum is in our top hand, and we're pivoting the effort around that to push the resistance, the water. Most joints in the body are third-class levers, as in the elbow joint that we looked at earlier. The fulcrum is here at the elbow, and the effort is applied by the biceps muscle against the resistance of the arm further away. Again, most joints of the body are third-class levers where we have resistance, effort, fulcrum. So let's pause here. Pull out your paper, close your books and note, and write down as much as you can remember about the last section of lecture. It's the physics. We have 3 classes of levers that we examined, as well as general characteristics of the synovial joint. See what you can get on your paper, then go to your notes, fill out the details. Do some instant recall. Challenge the brain. Make it curious and give it a desire to hold on to this information.